I remember the day it happened as if it were frozen in my mind, every detail sharp and unshakable. We had been together for over a year, sharing dreams, laughter, and those quiet moments that made me believe we were truly building a future together. I trusted him with my heart, and I thought he saw me for who I was, not just for the color of my skin. But that illusion shattered the day he invited me to meet his family. It was a sunny afternoon, the kind where the warmth feels like it should melt away all worries. I arrived at his parents' house with my best dress on, my hairstyle just right, holding a bouquet of flowers I had picked out to make a good impression. I told myself that this was the start of something beautiful, meeting the people who had raised the man I loved. But the moment I walked through the door, I felt the air change. The smiles on their faces were tight, their eyes scanning me in a way that wasn't about curiosity but about judgment. His mother barely made eye contact with me. His father shook my hand but pulled back quickly, as though my touch was something foreign. At first, I brushed it off as nerves or formality, telling myself they just needed time to warm up. We sat down in their living room, and I tried to keep the conversation light, sharing stories, asking about their family traditions. I wanted so badly for them to see me as a person, someone who could love their son with all my heart. But with every sentence I spoke, I could feel the walls between us getting taller. After dinner, I offered to help clear the table, thinking that maybe a simple gesture would bridge the gap. His mother followed me into the kitchen, and that's when it happened. She turned to me, her voice cold but steady, and said, "We don't accept black women in this family. You seem nice, but this will never work." The words hit me harder than I could have imagined. For a second, I thought I had misheard her. But her expression told me everything. There was no misunderstanding, no softening of the truth. I stood there holding a plate, my hands trembling. Every part of me wanted to speak, to defend myself, to ask her why she thought my worth could be measured by the color of my skin. But the lump in my throat made it impossible. All I could manage was a faint nod, as though acknowledging something I hadn't agreed to. When I returned to the dining room, my boyfriend was quiet, his eyes downcast, and in that silence, I knew he had already made his choice. On the drive home, he didn't speak much. I stared out the window, replaying every moment of the evening, hoping I could find some way to fix it. Finally, he sighed and said, "I think it's better if we end things. My family, they just wouldn't accept us." There it was, the final blow. He wasn't willing to fight for me, to stand beside me against their prejudice. Instead, he let their ignorance dictate the end of what I thought was love. The pain was sharp, not just because I had lost someone I cared about, but because it felt like my identity had been put on trial and found guilty without a defense. I thought about all the moments we had shared, the plans we had made, and how easily they had been erased by one evening and a handful of hateful words. It wasn't just the end of a relationship, it was a reminder of a reality I had tried so hard to believe was changing, a reality where love still wasn't enough to cross certain lines for some people. Even in the days that followed, I kept hearing her voice in my head, that cold, dismissive tone, as if she were closing a door that I hadn't even known was there. It wasn't just about losing him, it was about being told I wasn't worthy of the life I had envisioned, not because of my character, my values, or the love I had to give, but because of something as superficial as the color of my skin. The weight of that truth settled on me in a way that was both crushing and clarifying. It made me see the world a little differently, stripping away any lingering innocence I had about how deep prejudice could run. It made me realize that, for some people, acceptance wasn't something you could earn with kindness, intelligence, or loyalty, it was simply never going to be given. And in that moment, sitting in my apartment with the quiet pressing in around me, I knew that what had happened was going to change me. Not just in how I saw others, but in how I saw myself. The days after the breakup were a blur, a strange mixture of numbness and sharp stabs of emotion that came without warning. One moment I would be scrolling through my phone, trying to distract myself, and the next I would be hit with a memory so vivid it felt like it had just happened seconds ago. Every corner of my apartment reminded me of him, the coffee mugs we used together, the blanket he had wrapped around my shoulders one cold night, the playlists we made for long drives. It wasn't just the absence of his presence that hurt, it was the absence of what I thought we were building together. The rejection itself had left a wound deeper than any breakup I had experienced before. It wasn't about incompatibility or drifting apart. It was about being told, in no uncertain terms, that something as unchangeable as the color of my skin was a valid reason to walk away from love. That kind of pain doesn't fade quickly. It lingers, pressing against your chest, whispering questions you don't really want answers to. Was I really that easy to let go of? Was his love ever as deep as mine? Did I misread everything from the start? In the first few weeks, I cycled between sadness and anger. Some mornings I would wake up and feel like I could barely move, the weight of the rejection holding me down. Other mornings I would be seething, furious at him for not standing up for me, for not pushing back against his family's prejudice, for choosing the comfort of their approval over the truth of what we had. That anger was hot and restless, making me pace around my apartment, clenching my fists as if I could squeeze the betrayal out of my body. But somewhere in the middle of all that pain, a spark of something else began to form. It was small at first, just a whisper in the back of my mind telling me I didn't have to stay here, in this place of hurt, in this moment of rejection. It wasn't a fully formed plan or some grand vision of the future. It was simply the idea that I could take everything I was feeling, the grief, the humiliation, the disbelief, and channel it into something that didn't leave me powerless. I could turn this moment into fuel. The shift wasn't immediate. There were still nights when I cried myself to sleep, wondering if I would ever feel truly accepted by someone's family, if love would always come with a disclaimer for me. But slowly, that whisper grew louder. I began to focus less on what I had lost and more on what I could gain, not in terms of relationships, but in terms of myself. I thought about the life I wanted to build, a life so strong and full that it didn't matter who doubted me, who dismissed me, or who thought I wasn't enough. The determination came with its own kind of fire. I started setting goals, some big, some small. I cleaned out my apartment, removing every physical reminder of him. I began waking up earlier, using the extra hours to work on things I had been putting off for months. I picked up books about personal growth, financial independence, and building a career that wasn't just stable, but thriving. It wasn't about revenge, not in the petty sense. It was about reclaiming the narrative. If they had looked at me and seen someone unworthy, I was going to prove, to myself first, that they had been wrong. Friends noticed the change. They saw me pushing harder, speaking with more certainty, walking with a kind of purpose that wasn't there before. I didn't always share the details of what had happened. Not everyone needed to know the exact words his mother had spoken to me. But those who did know understood why I was suddenly so focused. This wasn't just a breakup recovery, it was a transformation. Of course, the hurt still lingered in the background, like an echo that refused to fully fade. There were moments when I would catch myself wondering if he ever thought about me, if he regretted his decision, if he realized the damage he had done. But each time those thoughts came, I would pull myself back to the present, to the steps I was taking towards something greater. I had been underestimated, written off, and dismissed. That was the truth of what happened. But the deeper truth was that I wasn't going to stay in that role for long. This wasn't about proving my worth to him, or to his family. It was about proving it to myself, about rising so far above the place they had tried to put me that their opinions no longer carried any weight in my world. That seed of determination that had started as a whisper was beginning to grow into something much bigger, and I could feel it pushing me forward, giving me the energy to keep moving even on the days when the pain threatened to pull me back. Starting from scratch was both terrifying and liberating. In the weeks after the breakup, I found myself staring at the pieces of my life scattered around me, wondering how to put them back together in a way that actually reflected who I wanted to be. I had nothing to hold me back anymore, no relationship to protect, no in-laws to impress, no need to fit into anyone else's expectations. All I had was me, and that realization carried a weight I couldn't ignore. The first step was financial stability. I knew I couldn't build anything lasting if I was constantly worried about bills or relying on someone else for support. I went through my bank statements line by line, cutting unnecessary expenses, canceling subscriptions I didn't use, and creating a budget that gave me control instead of anxiety. I picked up extra hours at work and even started a side hustle, offering freelance services in a skill I had been quietly honing for years. At first, the extra work was exhausting, but with every payment that came in, I felt a little more secure, a little more in control. From there, I turned my attention to my personal growth. I began reading every book I could find about success, mindset, and self-discipline. I took online courses to improve my skills, not just in my career but in areas I had always been curious about: public speaking, negotiation, leadership. I invested my time into learning things that could open doors later, even if I didn't know exactly where those doors would be. My evenings became less about mindless scrolling and more about building something tangible, something that belonged to me alone. I also started setting very specific goals. Not vague dreams or someday wishes, but measurable, actionable targets. I wanted to save a certain amount of money in 6 months, hit a specific milestone in my side business, and build a professional network that could lead to new opportunities. Every morning, I would write down the day's priorities and make sure they aligned with my bigger vision. I wasn't just working hard, I was working with intention. It wasn't easy. There were days when I questioned whether I was moving fast enough, whether the effort I was putting in would really pay off. There were nights when I felt the old doubts creeping back, telling me I wasn't capable of the kind of success I was chasing. But I learned to push through those moments, to treat them not as signs of failure but as part of the process. Whenever the voice of self-doubt got too loud, I would look at the small wins I had already achieved and remind myself that momentum builds slowly before it takes off. Building from scratch also meant changing my environment. I started surrounding myself with people who were driven, supportive, and forward-thinking. Some were old friends who had always believed in me. Others were new connections I made through networking events and online communities. Being around people who were chasing their own goals made it easier to chase mine. Their energy was contagious, their stories inspiring, and their encouragement helped silence the echoes of rejection that sometimes still haunted me. I noticed changes in myself that went beyond the tangible results. I carried myself differently. My posture straightened, my voice gained confidence, and I spoke about my plans without hesitation. I stopped downplaying my ambitions to make others comfortable. I began to own my achievements, no matter how small they seemed at the time. Every milestone felt like proof that I was capable of building a life that was entirely mine, a life that no one could take away because of prejudice or outdated beliefs. Even my mindset about setbacks began to shift. When something didn't work out, a deal fell through, a client didn't renew, a plan had to be scrapped, I no longer saw it as a dead end. Instead, I started asking myself what I could learn from it, how I could adjust and move forward. This resilience became one of my greatest tools. It allowed me to keep going when others might have given up, to see the long game instead of getting caught up in temporary disappointments. I began to realize that the most powerful thing about starting from scratch wasn't just the ability to create something new, it was the ability to decide exactly what that something would be. I was no longer building a life that needed someone else's approval. I was building a life that reflected my values, my priorities, and my vision for the future. Every day I worked toward it, brick by brick, step by step, knowing that the foundation I was laying now would be strong enough to support whatever came next. Breaking barriers and challenging stereotypes wasn't something I set out to do as a conscious mission at first, it began as a natural consequence of refusing to let other people's limitations define me. For so long, I had been told, directly and indirectly, what I could and couldn't be. The labels were unspoken but ever-present, where I was supposed to fit, what circles I belonged in, the kind of success I was allowed to reach. It was in the way some people tilted their heads when I spoke about my ambitions, as if they were indulging me in a fantasy. It was in the backhanded compliments that dressed disbelief in politeness. When I began making real progress toward my goals, I noticed how those same people reacted. Some were surprised in a way they didn't bother to hide, as if my achievements were an exception to the rule they believed in. Others tried to downplay it, suggesting luck played a bigger role than effort. I saw it clearly for what it was, a reflection of their own limitations, not mine. And every time I hit a milestone, I felt a silent satisfaction in proving that their narrow view of what I could be was wrong. I started stepping into spaces where I wasn't expected to be. Professional events where there were only a handful of people who looked like me, leadership meetings where my presence seemed to catch others off guard, networking circles where I had to introduce myself twice because my name didn't stick the first time. I didn't go in seeking validation from these rooms. I went in to take up space, to show that I had every right to be there, that my voice and ideas carried weight whether they were ready to acknowledge it or not. The more I moved forward, the more I realized that every step I took was bigger than just me. There were younger women watching, some of them facing the same subtle dismissals I had endured. They noticed how I spoke up when a conversation was trying to edge me out, how I kept my head high when someone underestimated me. I became aware that breaking barriers isn't always about smashing through them with loud declarations, it can also be about consistently, quietly, and unapologetically existing in places where others think you don't belong. There were times when pushing past these boundaries came with resistance. Sometimes it was overt, like being questioned more than others about my qualifications or being told outright that a certain opportunity might not be the right fit. Other times it was subtle, hidden in tones of voice, in the lack of eye contact, in being left out of informal conversations that often led to real decisions. Each instance was a reminder that the barriers were still there, even if they weren't always visible. But each one also gave me another reason to keep going, to make sure that the door stayed open wider than it had been for me. I learned that breaking stereotypes required a balance between proving them wrong and refusing to be defined by them in the first place. If I had focused solely on disproving every assumption, I would have been reacting to their narrative instead of building my own. So, I shifted my focus. I made my goals about what I wanted to achieve, not just about showing others they were wrong. In doing so, the progress I made was authentic, rooted in my own values and vision rather than in the need to convince anyone of my worth. This shift also gave me a different kind of confidence. I stopped trying to soften my presence to make others comfortable. I stopped shrinking my achievements to avoid being labeled as arrogant. I learned to take up my full space in every room, not just physically but in the way I contributed, the way I carried myself, and the way I refused to let my identity be used as a limitation. Every barrier I crossed seemed to lead to another one, but by then, I had built the resilience to keep going. I understood that progress often came with pushback, and that sometimes the very act of succeeding in certain spaces was a form of quiet rebellion. The stares, the surprise, the subtle attempts to exclude me, they all became background noise compared to the drive I felt to keep moving forward. And as I continued, I started to see change, not just in myself, but in the way others interacted with me. People who once doubted me began to seek my input, ask for my advice, even invite me into rooms they hadn't considered me for before. Some of it was genuine recognition, and some of it was a reluctant acknowledgement that I wasn't going away. Either way, the result was the same. The walls they thought would contain me had already begun to crack. Gaining recognition and power didn't happen in a single moment. It was the accumulation of countless small victories that, over time, began to draw attention. At first, the acknowledgement came quietly. A colleague forwarding my work to a senior manager with a note of praise, a client referring me to someone else because they were impressed, an invitation to speak on a small panel that eventually led to more significant opportunities. Each of these moments felt like a spark, tiny but enough to keep me moving forward with even greater focus. As my name began to circulate in different circles, I noticed a shift in how people approached me. Conversations that once felt dismissive now carried a tone of respect. Emails were answered more quickly, introductions were made without hesitation, and people started treating my time as valuable. It wasn't just about the financial gains, though those were significant, it was about being seen as a person of influence, someone whose voice could shape decisions. That realization was both empowering and humbling. With recognition came invitations into spaces I had once only imagined being part of. I found myself sitting at tables where major strategies were being decided, rooms where deals were negotiated, and partnerships were formed. The first time I was asked for my opinion on a high-stakes matter, I felt a flicker of nervousness, but it was quickly replaced by a deep sense of readiness. I had worked for this moment, prepared for it, and now I was living it. Every insight I shared, every solution I offered, added to the growing understanding that I belonged there, not as a token, not as an exception, but as a force in my own right. The power I was gaining wasn't about dominance, it was about influence and choice. I could decide where to direct my energy, which projects to take on, and which opportunities to decline. I could lend my voice to initiatives that mattered to me, using my platform to spotlight issues that had once been ignored. That kind of agency felt different from simply having a seat at the table, it meant having the ability to shape the table itself. Of course, this new position came with its own set of challenges. Recognition drew attention, and not all of it was positive. There were those who doubted my abilities, assuming my success was a result of external factors rather than merit. There were whispers, sideways glances, and subtle attempts to undermine my work. But by that point, I had developed a level of resilience that made those efforts less effective. Instead of shrinking under scrutiny, I let my results speak for themselves, delivering consistently and exceeding expectations until skepticism had no room to stand. As my influence grew, so did the number of people looking to me for guidance. Younger professionals reached out for mentorship, wanting to know how I had navigated challenges and built my path. I made time for these conversations, understanding how important it was to pass on not just advice, but also the belief that they, too, could carve their own space. I saw myself in many of them, the same spark in their eyes, the same hunger for something bigger than what they had been told was possible. In public spaces, I became more intentional about my presence. Whether I was speaking at an event, posting online, or engaging in interviews, I carried an awareness of the platform I had built. Every word had the potential to inspire, challenge, or shift perspectives, and I treated that responsibility with care. I learned to balance authenticity with strategy, ensuring that my message reached not only those who already supported me but also those who needed to hear it the most. The most surprising part of gaining recognition and power was how it began to reshape the narrative that had once been used against me. The same identity that had been treated as a limitation was now part of what made my story compelling. People wanted to know how I had overcome the barriers, how I had turned rejection into opportunity, and how I continued to thrive in spaces that were not built with me in mind. The questions often came with genuine curiosity, and I answered them not to justify myself, but to make it clear that success was not dependent on fitting into someone else's mold. With each new milestone, the influence I held expanded beyond my own career. I could advocate for others, push for changes in policies, and create pathways that hadn't existed before. It was a reminder that power isn't just about what you can achieve for yourself, it's also about how you can use it to open doors for others who might otherwise be left standing on the outside. When he came back, it wasn't with the casual confidence of someone who thought time had softened old wounds. It was with a different kind of energy, hesitant, almost fragile, as if he knew he was stepping into a space he no longer had any right to occupy. I remember the moment clearly, the way his name flashed on my phone after so long, stirring a mix of emotions I couldn't immediately untangle. I stared at the screen for several seconds, torn between ignoring it and answering just to hear what he had to say. When I finally picked up, his voice carried a strange mixture of nostalgia and regret. He tried to start with small talk, asking how I'd been, what I'd been up to, but there was a weight behind his words, a hesitation that told me there was more he wanted to say. Eventually, it came out he'd been following my journey from a distance, watching as I built a life that looked nothing like the one I had when we were together. He had seen my achievements, my growing presence in places he had never expected me to reach, and it had stirred something in him he couldn't ignore. He said he missed me. He said he thought about what we had and how he had walked away from it. But there was an unspoken layer to his confession, a recognition of what I had become since then. I was no longer the woman he had left behind, struggling to find her footing after his family's rejection. I was someone who had built a career, earned respect, and commanded her own space. He knew it, and I could hear in his voice that it intimidated him as much as it drew him back. The conversation was surreal. He spoke about his regrets, about how he wished he had handled things differently, about how he had let his family's opinions dictate his decisions. He admitted that it had been cowardice, that he hadn't been strong enough to stand up for me back then. His words painted a picture of someone haunted by the consequences of his own choices. I listened, letting him speak, feeling a strange mix of vindication and detachment. Part of me wanted to remind him of the night his mother had looked me in the eye and told me I would never be accepted, and how he had sat in silence, letting her words hang in the air without protest. Another part of me didn't need to, it was already written in the tone of his voice, in the way he was trying to rewrite the ending of a story that had already been closed. He spoke about wanting another chance, about believing that things could be different now, but his plea wasn't just about love. It was about the life I had built without him and the undeniable fact that I had thrived in his absence. The way he talked about my accomplishments told me everything I needed to know. There was admiration there, but also an underlying realization of what he had lost, not just me as a person, but the version of our future that could have been if he had chosen differently. He mentioned how proud he was of me, how he had always believed I could do great things, but the truth was that he had never said those words when I actually needed to hear them. Now, they felt less like encouragement and more like an attempt to bridge a gap that had grown too wide. Seeing him again in person later only deepened that awareness. He looked at me differently, studying me as if trying to reconcile the woman standing before him with the woman he had left. There was respect in his eyes, yes, but also a hint of disbelief, as though part of him still couldn't quite process how far I had come. He asked questions about my work, my travels, the people I had met along the way. He seemed genuinely fascinated, but I could feel that his fascination was laced with a kind of longing that had nothing to do with curiosity and everything to do with regret. The moments of silence between us were telling. They carried the weight of the past, the missed chances, the words left unsaid, the love that had been cut short not by incompatibility but by fear and prejudice. His attempt to step back into my life felt like an acknowledgement that he had underestimated me, that he had never imagined I would rise to where I was now. And maybe, in his mind, coming back was a way to correct that mistake, to prove to himself that it wasn't too late to be part of my story again. But the truth was, time had changed everything. The version of me he remembered no longer existed. The woman sitting across from him was shaped by challenges he hadn't faced with me, victories he hadn't celebrated by my side, and battles he hadn't fought on my behalf. I had learned how to stand without him, how to thrive without his validation, and how to define my worth without needing his acceptance. He might have been trying to step back into a chapter he had once closed, but the story had already moved far beyond the point where he had left it.